When the door opened that cold Wednesday afternoon, I expected an old, grizzled repairman, but instead Ryan walked in. Young, powerful, and magnetic, he ignited feelings I hadn't felt in decades. As I watched him work, tension crackled in the air, and before I knew it, my once quiet home became the stage for an encounter I never saw coming. I never thought my life would turn out this way. At 60, I lived alone in a house that felt too large and too quiet, each room a hollow reminder of the life I used to have. My children had grown up and moved away, my husband had left years ago, and I found myself surrounded by the echoes of a past I couldn't let go of. The kitchen, once the heart of our family, was now just another neglected space, its silence as heavy as my solitude. I'd learned to live with it, filling my days with routine, and avoiding the moments when loneliness became unbearable. But even as I kept up appearances, I couldn't deny the emptiness creeping into my life. Little things like the dripping sink in the kitchen became symbolic of the neglect I felt in my own heart. I told myself it didn't matter, until it did. That Wednesday started like any other. I had finally called someone to fix the sink, a small act of necessity more than anything else. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a polite conversation with a handyman who'd be in and out in no time. When the doorbell rang, I opened it to a stranger who would change everything. Ryan was nothing like I'd imagined. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, with a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with the nervous energy in his eyes. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, his simple gray shirt clinging to his chest as he carried his toolbox inside. There was a warmth about him that felt out of place in my cold, lifeless home. "Where's the sink?" he asked, his deep voice steady yet inviting. I directed him to the kitchen and stood back, unsure why I felt so on edge. As he crouched beneath the counter, his hands deftly working on the pipes, I found myself watching him more closely than I should have. He brought something into my house that I hadn't felt in years, a sense of vitality, of presence. I didn't realize it at the time, but Ryan wasn't just here to fix my sink. He was about to shake the very foundation of the life I thought I knew. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than a fleeting moment, a tiny spark of excitement in an otherwise mundane existence. Ryan worked quietly, focused on the task at hand, and I told myself it was just admiration for his skill and youth that had me lingering nearby. But as the minutes passed, I couldn't deny that something deeper was stirring within me, something I hadn't felt in years. The silence between us grew heavier as he worked. I stood by the kitchen island, pretending to be busy with something else, but my eyes were drawn to him. The way his muscles tensed as he tightened a bolt, the slight furrow in his brow as he concentrated, it was mesmerizing in a way I couldn't explain. I felt foolish, standing there like some infatuated teenager, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. "Everything okay down there?" I asked, my voice betraying a nervous edge. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine for just a moment before quickly darting back to the sink. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady, though I thought I caught a flicker of something in his expression. Hesitation, maybe, or discomfort. It should have ended there. I should have thanked him for his work, paid him, and let him leave. But something about the way his hand brushed against mine when I passed him a towel made my pulse quicken. It was such a simple, innocent gesture, yet it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. His fingers lingered just a second too long, and when I looked at him, I saw the faintest hint of color rise to his cheeks. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I walked into the kitchen, I remembered the way his voice had sounded, deep and soothing, and the way his eyes had avoided mine, as if he were trying to hide something. The tension became impossible to ignore when he called a week later to check on the sink. I knew it wasn't standard for a handyman to follow up on such a routine repair, but I played along, my heart racing as I invited him back to fix another issue I had conveniently discovered. When he arrived, the air between us was charged in a way I'd never experienced before. He was polite, professional even, but his hands trembled slightly as he unpacked his tools. I stayed close, offering coffee and making small talk, but beneath the surface, there was an unspoken awareness growing between us. His eyes would meet mine briefly, then dart away, and I could see the internal conflict written all over his face. By the time he finished the minor repair, I couldn't take the tension anymore. I reached out, lightly touching his arm as I thanked him. He froze, his eyes widening as if my touch had broken some unspoken rule. "If there's anything else you need," I said, my voice softer than I intended, trailing off as he stepped back, his cheeks flushed. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice strained. "I'm all set." But as he left, I caught the slightest hesitation in his step, a lingering glance that told me this wasn't over. The line between professional courtesy and something far more dangerous had already begun to blur. I knew I shouldn't have called him back. It was reckless, selfish even. But the moment Ryan stepped through my door that afternoon, I knew it was too late to turn back. The quiet, predictable life I had carefully constructed was already crumbling, and I found myself leaning into the chaos, craving the thrill that only his presence seemed to bring. This time he seemed different, more guarded, yet somehow more vulnerable. His usual calm, professional demeanor was intact, but I could sense the tension in his movements, the way he avoided looking at me for too long. I led him upstairs to the bathroom, where I had claimed there was a problem with the faucet. It was a minor issue, nothing that truly warranted a house call, but he didn't question it. As he worked, I hovered nearby, pretending to straighten the towels or adjust the soap dispenser. My heart raced every time he glanced my way, and I couldn't ignore the way his hands trembled slightly as he tightened the faucet. The air between us was heavy with unspoken tension, and I knew he felt it too. "I've been thinking," I said softly, breaking the silence. My voice sounded foreign to me, low and intimate. He paused, his hands still on the faucet, but didn't look up. "About last time," I continued, my words hanging in the air. He exhaled slowly, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the wrench. "I shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then why did you?" I asked, stepping closer. He didn't answer, but I saw the way his shoulders tensed, the conflict playing out across his face. I reached out, placing a hand lightly on his arm. He froze under my touch, his breath hitching as his eyes finally met mine. "You don't have to pretend," I said, my voice trembling. "I know you feel it too." For a moment, I thought he would pull away, that he would gather his tools and leave without a word. But then something shifted. His resolve seemed to crack, and he turned to face me fully, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite name. "This isn't right," he said, though his words lacked conviction. His hands, rough and calloused, brushed against mine as if testing the waters. "You know this isn't right." "Maybe not," I said, stepping closer. "But does it matter?" The distance between us disappeared in an instant. His lips found mine with an urgency that sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt years of loneliness melt away in the heat of that kiss. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. There was only him, his touch, his breath, his undeniable presence. We pulled apart briefly, our foreheads resting against each other as we struggled to catch our breath. "This isn't who I am," he said, his voice raw. "I don't do this." "Neither do I admitted, my fingers trailing along the edge of his jaw. "But here we are." The hours that followed were a blur of sensation and emotion, each moment more intense than the last. Ryan's hands were both gentle and insistent, his touch igniting something in me that I thought had long since died. We moved together in a rhythm that felt both foreign and natural, as though we had been waiting for this moment all our lives. But beneath the passion there was a quiet desperation, a knowledge that this was as dangerous as it was exhilarating. When we finally lay tangled together, the room bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, I couldn't bring myself to speak. Neither could he. Words felt unnecessary, even unwelcome. The silence between us said more than words ever could. As Ryan traced lazy patterns on my skin, his touch both comforting and possessive, I found myself wondering what would happen next. This wasn't just a fleeting moment, a one-time lapse in judgment. It was something deeper, something that had already begun to take root in both of us. He sighed, his breath warm against my neck. "This can't last," he said softly, more to himself than to me. "I know," I replied, though the words felt like a lie. Because in that moment, with his arms wrapped around me, I didn't want to think about the future. I didn't want to think about the consequences or the impossibilities. I just wanted to stay here in this stolen moment for as long as I could. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting shadows across the room, I knew that the line we had crossed could never be uncrossed. And no matter how much I wanted to hold on to this fleeting connection, reality was waiting just beyond the door. I thought I could keep it a secret, keep it contained within the walls of my quiet, empty home. But the truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how hard you try to hide it. What started as stolen moments with Ryan began to seep into every corner of my life, and the cracks in my carefully constructed facade were becoming impossible to ignore. The first sign came a few days after our encounter in the bedroom. My neighbor, a nosy but well-meaning woman named Carol, stopped me during one of my morning walks. "I saw that young man leaving your house the other day," she said, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. A relative of yours? I froze, caught off guard by her question. Just a handyman, I replied quickly, forcing a smile. The sink was acting up again. She nodded, but the look on her face told me she wasn't convinced. I hurried away, my heart racing as I realized how precarious my situation had become. If Carol had noticed, who else might have seen? And what would they think if they knew the truth? Ryan and I continued to see each other in secret, our meetings growing more frequent and more intense. Every time he walked through my door, I felt a rush of excitement that I hadn't experienced in years. But with that excitement came a gnawing sense of guilt, a voice in the back of my mind reminding me that this couldn't last. It all came to a head one evening when Ryan arrived unannounced. I was in the living room, flipping through an old photo album, when I heard the knock at the door. My heart leapt as I hurried to answer it, but the sight of him standing there, his face drawn and his eyes shadowed, filled me with a sense of unease. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and strained. I stepped aside to let him in, my stomach twisting with anxiety. He walked past me into the living room, his movements stiff and deliberate. He didn't sit down, didn't make himself comfortable like he usually did. Instead, he stood by the window, staring out at the darkened street. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face me, and the look in his eyes made my chest tighten. "I don't think I can do this anymore," he said, his words heavy with regret. "It's too much." I felt the ground shift beneath me, as though the air had been knocked out of my lungs. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "This," he said, gesturing between us. "Us. It's not right. It's not fair to you, to me. And it's not fair to anyone else who might get caught up in this." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't find the words. Because deep down I knew he was right. What we were doing wasn't sustainable. It wasn't real. It was a fleeting escape from reality, a brief reprieve from the loneliness that had consumed us both. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he continued, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean to feel this way about you. But I can't ignore the fact that we're from two completely different worlds. And sooner or later, this is going to hurt us both." Tears welled up in my eyes as I listened to him speak, each word cutting deeper than the last. "So that's it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You're just going to walk away?" He hesitated, his jaw clenching as he struggled to find the right words. "I don't want to," he admitted. "But I think it's the only choice we have." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was deafening, filled with all the things we wanted to say but couldn't. Finally, he stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch mine. His fingers were warm against my skin, but the gesture felt like a goodbye. "I'll never forget you," he said softly, his eyes locked on mine. "You've changed me in ways I can't even explain. But this has to end." I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. The tears spilled over, streaking down my cheeks as I watched him turn and walk toward the door. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, and for a moment I thought he might turn back. But then he opened the door and stepped outside, the cold night air rushing in to fill the void he left behind. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the closed door, my mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, regret, they all swirled together, leaving me feeling hollow and broken. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it was for the best. That Ryan had been right to walk away. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the pain of losing him refused to fade. Every time I walked into the kitchen, I was reminded of the moments we had shared there. Every time I passed the bathroom, I thought of the tension that had crackled between us as he worked on the faucet. And then, just when I thought I might finally be able to move on, I saw him again. It was a week after he had left, and I was walking through the park, trying to clear my head. I didn't expect to see him there, sitting on a bench, his head in his hands. He looked up as I approached, his eyes widening in surprise. "Hannah," he said, his voice filled with something I couldn't quite place. Relief, maybe, or regret. "Ryan," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The world around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us in that small, quiet corner of the park. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "I know," I said, my voice trembling. "But you did." His eyes filled with tears, and he looked away, his hands clenching into fists. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "I don't even know if I can." I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "Maybe we can't fix it," I said softly. "But that doesn't mean it wasn't real." He looked back at me, his expression filled with anguish and something else. something that looked a lot like hope. And in that moment, I realized that while our story might be over, the impact we had on each other would never fade. The days after Ryan left were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. The house felt even quieter than before, the emptiness stretching endlessly around me. Every corner held a memory of him. A fleeting smile, the warmth of his touch, the way his voice would drop just slightly when he spoke my name. It was as if he had left a ghost behind, one that lingered in the spaces he had filled with life. I tried to return to my routine, but it was no use. The weight of what had happened between us pressed heavily on my chest, making even the simplest tasks feel insurmountable. Cooking dinner for one, sitting alone in front of the television, folding laundry in the stillness of my bedroom. All of it reminded me of how much I had lost, not just in Ryan, but in the life I had built before him. The guilt was the worst part. I had spent so long convincing myself that I was above temptation, that I was stronger than the pull of forbidden desires. But Ryan had proven me wrong. He had unraveled me, exposing a part of myself I hadn't even realized was still there. And while I didn't regret the time we had shared, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had betrayed something sacred. I wasn't the only one struggling. Ryan had made it clear that our relationship was weighing on him, too. Though he had walked away, I could still feel the echoes of his internal battle, the way his heart had pulled him in one direction while his mind had pushed him in another. He hadn't wanted to leave any more than I had wanted to let him go, but we both knew it was the only choice we could make. Still, I found myself reaching for my phone late at night, scrolling through our brief text exchanges, my thumb hovering over his name. 100 times I almost called him, desperate to hear his voice, to feel even the smallest connection to him again. But I never did. I knew that calling him would only make things harder, for both of us. The world outside seemed to carry on as usual, oblivious to the turmoil I was facing. My neighbor Carol continued her morning walks, nodding politely as we passed each other. The local grocery store played the same upbeat music as I wandered its aisles, picking up the same items I always bought. But I felt like a stranger in my own life, a shadow of the woman I had been before Ryan had come into it. One night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I realized that I couldn't keep living this way. Ryan was gone, and no amount of longing or regret would bring him back. I had to find a way to move forward, to reclaim the pieces of myself that had been lost in the whirlwind of our brief, intense connection. So I started small. I cleaned out the kitchen, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed, as if I could wipe away the memories along with the dust. I took long walks through the park, breathing in the crisp autumn air and letting the changing leaves remind me that life was always moving forward, even when it felt like it had stopped. I joined a book club at the local library, forcing myself to engage with others, even when all I wanted to do was retreat into my solitude. Bit by bit, I began to rebuild. But the process wasn't linear. There were days when the pain of losing Ryan felt as fresh as it had the moment he walked out the door, when I would collapse onto the couch and cry until there were no tears left. There were nights when I dreamed of him, waking up with the ache of his absence like a phantom limb. But there were also moments of clarity, of peace. I realized that Ryan had given me something I hadn't even known I needed. He had reminded me that I was still alive, still capable of feeling, of wanting, of being wanted. He had broken through the walls I had built around myself, showing me that there was more to life than the quiet, predictable existence I had settled for. In the end, Ryan had left me with more than he had taken away. The spark he had ignited within me hadn't faded. It had transformed into something stronger, something more enduring. It was a reminder that even in the face of loss, there was always the possibility of renewal. I still thought of him often. I wondered if he was happy, if he had found the peace he had been searching for. But I didn't dwell on those thoughts for long. Instead, I focused on the life I was building for myself, a life that was richer and more vibrant than the one I had known before. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I began to see the experience for what it was, a chapter in my story, one that had shaped me but didn't define me. It was a reminder that even in the quietest moments, life had a way of surprising you, of reminding you that you were never truly alone. And though I missed him, though I would always carry the memory of him with me, I knew that I would be okay. Because for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. And that, I realized, was something worth holding on to. Months had passed since Ryan left my life, and though the pain of his absence still lingered, it had softened into something more manageable. I found myself reflecting on what our brief, intense relationship had meant, not just to him, but to me. It wasn't about the passion we had shared or the secrecy of it all. It was about what it had awakened within me. A part of myself I thought I had lost forever. For years, I had been living in a state of quiet resignation, going through the motions of life without truly engaging with it. I had accepted loneliness as my companion, believing that my time for adventure, for connection, had long since passed. But Ryan had shown me that wasn't true. He had reminded me that I was still capable of feeling deeply, of wanting and being wanted. At first, I grappled with the guilt. How could I have let myself get so swept up in something that I knew couldn't last? How could I justify the risks I had taken, the boundaries I had crossed? But over time, I came to understand that what had happened between us wasn't about right or wrong, it was about rediscovery. It was about finding the courage to embrace the parts of myself I had buried for so long. In the aftermath of our time together, I began to rebuild my life with a new sense of purpose. I took up painting, a hobby I had always dreamed of pursuing but had never found the time for. The act of brushing vibrant colors onto a blank canvas felt therapeutic, as though I were filling the empty spaces in my heart with something beautiful and meaningful. I joined a local book club, reconnecting with old friends and forging new connections. I even started volunteering at a nearby community center, finding joy in giving back to others. Through it all, I carried Ryan's memory with me, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of what I was capable of. He had come into my life at a time when I needed him most, and though our relationship had been fleeting, its impact was profound. He had been a catalyst, sparking a transformation that I hadn't even realized I needed. One evening, as I sat on the back porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. The sky was painted with hues of gold and pink, and the crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves. For the first time in a long time, I felt content, not just with my life, but with myself. I realized then that life didn't have to follow a predetermined path. It didn't have to fit neatly into the boxes we created for ourselves. Sometimes the most profound experiences came from the most unexpected places. Ryan had been one of those experiences, a fleeting chapter in my story that had forever changed the way I saw the world, and myself. As I finished my glass of wine and headed inside, I thought about the future. It was uncertain, of course, but that no longer scared me. Because I had learned that even in the face of loss and heartbreak, there was always the possibility of renewal. There was always the chance to begin again. And so, I carried on, holding on to the lessons Ryan had taught me. I moved forward, not with regret, but with gratitude for the memories we had shared, for the person I had become, and for the endless possibilities that lay ahead. What would you do if faced with a moment that could change your life forever? Would you take the risk or play it safe? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the complexities of love, betrayal, and self-discovery. Stay tuned for the next captivating tale. You won't want to miss it.